We left off talking about Hawaii being entered into the United States first as a territory and then as a state in 1959. Alaska actually had a similar storyline where it was entered as a territory in the 1800s and then later on as a state. Why do you think Alaska was entered into America? The main reason why Alaska was considered as to become a territory and later on a state is Britain had control of Canada and Russia had control of what is Alaska, and Russia was afraid that Britain would come over from Canada and just take Alaska. So they ended up putting it on the market. And the guy in the picture here is William Seward, and he was actually the guy, if you remember, he was Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, and he was the one that there was a failed assassination attempt where they jumped on the bed and they stabbed him a bunch of times in the face and the neck. I'm thinking it's on the other side of his face that received most of the damage because you really can't see it, any damage to his head here. But he was the same guy, and in 1867 he really supported buying Alaska from Russia and was able to get a really cheap price for it. The only problem was most Americans and most politicians at this time considered it a big mistake. They actually called it Seward's Folly, and even though he went through with it and got it for a very cheap price, $7.2 million. All right, and this is the actual check that the United States wrote to Russia in order to buy Alaska. So $7.2 million for all of that territory, this big piece of territory, which we found out much later on has a crazy amount of natural resources, including a lot of oil. Another area that became pretty much a U.S. territory where we had control over it, but it wasn't an official territory of the United States, is Cuba. We have a very long history with Cuba, and originally, going back to 1492, it was claimed by Columbus. And then, as you see here, from 1511 to 1895, it was ruled by the Spanish. But in 1895, there was a rebellion by the people of Cuba because the Spanish were setting up concentration camps. So this is one of the first instances of concentration camps much earlier than World War II. And it was pretty horrific. It was very similar to World War II, as you can see from the pictures here. These are some of the people that were in Cuban concentration camps under Spanish rule. So America goes in and helps Cuba actually gain its independence, but it doesn't totally get independence, and it kind of leads to the history that the United States has with Cuba even to this day. One of the reasons that America was able to gain support to go in and help Cuba was through yellow journalism, and it's called that because it's basically a form of journalism that stretches the truth or even makes things up in order to gain public support. So yellow journalism, you may recognize this guy's name, Joseph Pulitzer, because now they have what's called the Pulitzer Prize, and that's a prize you get for writing something great, and it's given to journalists and authors. And then you have William Randolph Hearst, and these two guys ran competing newspapers, and they employed yellow journalism in order to get their message out. Pulitzer had the New York World, and Hearst had the New York American. So these were the two main newspapers in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they sold millions and millions of copies of these, and basically were able to tell the public what was going on in Cuba and spread the word and actually gain public support for us to get involved in Cuba. Another reason why we got involved is the Spanish ambassador to the United States criticized President McKinley in a letter, and it's called the DeLome letter. And he calls him in the letter a weak jingo. And jingo means it's pretty much I have the three little things on here: the extreme belief, your own country is always best, which is often shown in enthusiastic support for a war against another country. That's one way of looking at it. Basically, it's patriotism on steroids is the easiest way to understand what jingoism is. If you've seen people go nuts during World Cup soccer matches, rooting for their home country and stuff like that, that can be considered a form of jingoism. If they really took it to the extreme, let's say England's playing Ireland and a bunch of English people beat up a group of Irish people because they're supporting their team and their country. It's really taking patriotism to the next level, and usually it happens in the form of war. Now, these Pulitzer and Hearst newspapers started writing about what was going on in Cuba, and specifically, they talked about this warship, the USS Maine, that was exploded, and it was on the coast of Cuba. And basically, they sent out these rewards: who destroyed the Maine, and basically, it was blown up because of a problem in the kitchen. It was like an internal error. Either somebody made a mistake, or there was just a malfunction in the kitchen. It wasn't blown up by the Spanish, which they claimed that it was. So it was pretty much this explosion occurs, and it's a U.S. ship, and they start rallying everybody to go to war with the Spanish. And they're successful. McKinley ultimately takes the U.S. to war, and the war is a very quick and easy war. It's a Spanish-American war. Don't confuse it with the Mexican-American War, which happened in 1850. This one happens in 1898, and it's against Spain, where the Mexican-American War is against Mexico. So that's how they get their names. But the Spanish-American War happens mostly in Cuba. There's also a little invasion that occurs during this war, and it's kind of lumped in with this war, that happens in the Philippines, which is actually all the way out off of the coast of Asia. So during the Spanish-American War, you can see how long it lasted, just April 25th to August 12th. So it only lasted a few months. During this time, Teddy Roosevelt quits as the Associate Secretary of the Navy, which is a pretty high post, and he says, I want to go and be part of this war. And he ends up getting a group of people called the Rough Riders, and it's people that he went to college with at Harvard. It's friends of his from there. It's Native Americans and people that and black cowboys that he met out west when he was exploring out west. And it's just this really weird ragtag group of people that he puts together and brings down to Cuba to go to war. And they're best known, the Rough Riders, for their charge on San Juan Hill, where they defeated and pushed back the Spanish and took the hill. Here's a picture, and this is Teddy Roosevelt right in the middle, and this is a lot of his Rough Riders. So they're this weird mix of poor, uneducated minorities, and then there's these rich, well-to-do Harvard people. It's just very weird dynamic, but that's kind of what Teddy Roosevelt was, this weird dynamic as a person too. And you see some darker skinned guys over here, so I don't know if they're the Native Americans or the black troops, but he did have both of those classes represented in the Rough Riders. Now, during the Spanish-American War, there's a couple things that you need to know. The Teller Amendment, and it basically says the United States can annex Cuba but can't control it. So they can take control. They can pretty much grant Cuba its independence and separate it from Spain, but they can't take full control of it. That's the first treaty that's signed with Spain. Then there's the Treaty of Paris, which recognized Cuban independence, but in exchange for that, the U.S. gets Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And Guam and the Philippines are out in the Pacific Ocean. And Puerto Rico, you know where that is, in the Caribbean. Okay, and that ends up becoming a U.S. territory. And so do these two. The Platt Amendment is the final treaty, if you will, and this one is Cuba is forced to agree to this, and it gives us 2 military bases, and we have pretty much complete military control over Cuba. So this is one of the things where when Fidel Castro becomes the president of Cuba and they have their Cuban Revolution, they have a second revolution, and that time it's to get America out and bring in a communist regime. And that happens about 50 years later. Here's the Philippines, and that's where it's located, right off of Asia. So you see how it's really not connected with stuff that's going on in the Caribbean. We just sent some of our Great White Fleet over to Asia and took these islands because they were there for the taking, essentially. And here's Guam too. So the Philippines are here, Guam's here, gives us some more of those areas out in the Pacific. And now in the Caribbean, you got Florida up here. Here's Cuba, which is pretty much, I think it's 80 miles off of the coast of Florida between those two. And then you have Puerto Rico down here, and we gain control of both of those. The Panama Canal. It's originally controlled by Colombia. Colombia doesn't want to sell it, but there's a Panamanian Revolution, and we backed the revolution in 1903 to gain control of what the area is where we put the Panama Canal. It's this little section right here. Okay, so the U.S. ends up getting control of that in 1903, roughly. Okay, and then they start in 1905 building the Panama Canal. And here's Teddy Roosevelt in white on a construction, some machine while they're building the Panama Canal. Here's what the canal looks like today. And basically, it's a lock system canal where basically these gates come up, and then when a ship comes right here, this gate will come down and allow water to come in until it raises the ship up to the next level, and then they'll move over here, and then this lock will come back up, and this lock will come down and raise the water level till they can come here. And they have to do this because there's different sea levels on either side of the canal. So there's a whole system of locks. I think it's 5 or 6 locks that you have to go through, and here's all the different locks that you have to go through in order to get from one side, from the Caribbean Ocean, that side, to the Pacific Ocean. Roosevelt's corollary. This is important aspect of Roosevelt and his administration, and basically he adds on to the Monroe Doctrine. If you remember the Monroe Doctrine, it says to Europe, don't mess with the West, we've got this under control. Roosevelt pretty much issues an additional threat and says to Europe, don't mess with the West again. And how he backs up his threat is through big stick diplomacy. And basically what big stick diplomacy is, Teddy Roosevelt had a saying, walk quietly but carry a big stick, and it basically was you can make threats as long as you're able to, or it's actually, I'm sorry, not walk quietly, it's speak softly but carry a big stick. And it's basically you can make threats, you can intimidate people, but you better have enough power to back it up. And he was always ready to back it up. We're going to finish this for right now. I have a couple more little slides about imperialism, and then we're going to get into World War I and other things on our next little video. All right, thanks.